On today's episode of You Asked, why buy a more expensive Blu-ray player? Also, Blu-ray players versus game consoles. Are 70-inch TVs any good? Is all eARC HDMI 2.1 and is all HDMI 2.1 eARC? And will we ever get QD-OLED with MLA? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Caleb Dennison, and this is You Asked, the show where I answer questions that you asked in hopes that I can help you and others who have the same tech questions. If you've got a question you'd like to see answered on the show, please send it to youasked@digitaltrends.com, and I'll do my best to get it answered. Okay, Mike B writes, I've seen some discussions on Twitter/Reddit about varying picture quality among 4K UHD players. Ignoring build quality, HDR formats, extra features, etc., shouldn't all players be able to read the data from the disc and send the pure signal to the AVR or TV without any issue? If the player isn't doing any sort of processing, why would there be any difference in picture quality? Well, thank you for the question, Mike. I love this one. And first of all, please don't misunderstand me when I say this. I'm not trying to minimize the validity of your question here at all. But this question mattered a lot more a few years ago than it does now. The reason? Well, we just don't have a wide range of brands or models to choose from anymore. Anyone still making a Blu-ray player is making a pretty decent player. We've got Sony, Panasonic, and LG as the big brands. Then we have specialty players like Revon and Magnetar. Rip Oppo. Leave a comment if I left one out, and game consoles don't count. I'm getting to that. However, we do still see some range within the few options that we can buy. What might make one better in terms of picture quality than the other? Well, frankly, not a lot. But what difference in picture quality that can exist resides in the decoding process. This disc is full of encoded video that needs to be decoded before it can be sent along an HDMI cable to your TV. Decoding has less impact on video signal quality than processing. I'm getting to that part too, but it can have an impact, a very tiny, minuscule, difficult for most folks, including yours truly, to perceive impact. Now, processing, that's a different story. The most noticeable difference in processing is going to be in de-interlacing some Blu-ray discs and in upscaling anything 1080i and lower. But that is only if you allow the player to do any processing at all. If your TV is nice enough, its processing will be better than your disc player. If you have a lower end TV, maybe the player's processing is better, but on a lower end TV like that, doubtful you'd see any difference anyway. No, most of the price difference between players is going to be justified elsewhere, outside of the video signal quality. The build quality, including the drive mechanism, the transport tray, and the chassis, or it may be in the audio section. A premium player may have better digital to analog audio converters, which can pay off if you're using the player for CD or DVD audio or SACD playback. You may also notice a difference in startup times and disk loading times as well. Generally speaking, more expensive players are more likely to last longer. They're going to operate quieter and operate more quickly. They may also be just less buggy because they use a more powerful chipset. Following up on that question is another one about Blu-ray coming from Josh Collins, who writes, Hey Caleb, you mentioned a few episodes ago about how getting a dedicated 4K Blu-ray player is much better than the PS5 and Series X. I see this sentiment expressed all over the internet, but besides the lack of Dolby Vision support for the game consoles, what makes them different or better? And would the Sony X700M be that much better than a PS5, or do I need to spend way more for a good player? So Josh, not to be argumentative, but did I really say much better? I feel like I didn't, but if I did, I may have overstated the difference. I do remember saying that the PS5 is much better than the Xbox though, and I stand by that. The PS5 handles 24 FPS content far better than the Series X, which shows more judder. Look, if you want to put a Blu-ray or a 4K Blu-ray disc in either of the game consoles and watch that movie, you'll be able to do that. You'll even get basic HDR and to some extent Dolby Atmos if you want it. Put the disc in, watch the movie, job done. However, dedicated 4K Blu-ray players will offer better decoding, which we just talked about, and if you want them to, better processing than either of the consoles. Will you notice the difference? I'm not sure, especially between, say, the PS5 and a dedicated player like the X700M that you brought up. Where the differences start becoming more noticeable is that neither console, as you pointed out, plays back in Dolby Vision, and last I heard, neither played back HDR10 Plus. Not that there's all that many discs with HDR10 Plus on them in the first place. Also, while getting Dolby Atmos out of a PS5 is pretty straightforward, getting it out of an Xbox is a much bigger hassle. You got to download an app for it, and I know that on the Xbox One, it wasn't even real Dolby Atmos. Speaking of audio, neither of them is a good CD player, let alone SACD player. So if you want your disc player to do more than 4K Blu-rays, I'd say get a dedicated player. End of story. Jeffrey Hine writes, I've always heard you should go for the biggest TV that makes sense in your space. I've recently moved and the new room configuration would work perfectly with a 70-inch TV. Are there any top brands or models available in this size that you recommend? Or is it almost always the better option to stick with 65 inches? And thanks for making learning about TVs fun and educational. I had never even heard of a nit before I found your channel, and now I'm a full-blown nerd for this stuff. Aha! Another nit nerd convert. I love it. This, by the way, is a good opportunity to mention to Jeff and anyone else that we have Nit Nerd merch available. Link to the store is below. So, Jeff, your question is deceivingly tricky. Initially, I think most folks would tell you that if money is not an object, buy the larger version of a TV within a model series. For instance, if you wanted to get a TCL QM8, get a 75-inch QM8 instead of a 65-inch QM8. Most of the time, the larger version of a given model is going to be as good as the smaller version. Most of the time. Sometimes, though, due to panel supply considerations, a manufacturer may have to use a different kind of LCD panel at a larger size. For instance, a certain TV model in the 55 and 65-inch sizes may use a VA type panel, but the 75-inch version uses an IPS or ADS type panel. This is the case with the Hisense U8K, I believe. The 65 and even the 85-inch versions use VA type panels, but the 75-inch uses a high-end IPS ADS type panel. Now, I've not tested the 75-inch version of the Hisense U8K, for example, but those TVs I have tested that had ADS type panels were extremely close in performance to their VA type counterparts. It used to be that the older IPS panels had much worse contrast than the VA panels, but the new ADS panels are much better, and with mini LED backlighting on the rise, they look just as contrasty as the VA panels in most cases. Why exactly, though, do manufacturers switch panel types depending on the size? Well, the reason actually ties in with another part of your question that I think is really important to address here. You asked about 70-inch TV specifically, and I don't know if you were just using 70 as in the 70-inch-ish neighborhood, or if you actually meant you were looking at specifically 70-inch TVs versus 65-inch TVs. Either way, I think this is important for everyone to know. 70-inch TVs, as opposed to 75-inch TVs, that 70-inch size tends to be found on lower-end TV models, whereas more premium TV models tend to have the 75-inch panel sizes. The reason, and this is a very simplified explanation, but the reason is because TV manufacturers source their panels from a bunch of different panel suppliers. The 70-inch panels tend to be lower cost and slightly lower quality, whereas the 75-inch panels tend to be higher cost and higher quality. This is why with some lower end to mid-tier TVs, we'll hear people talking about whether the TV they got has a panel from panel company A versus panel company B. There can be some variances there. You see where I'm going with this? If you're looking at actual 70-inch TVs, you will be probably looking at lower end to mid-end TVs, whereas if you're looking at 75-inch TVs, you're looking at higher performance TVs, most likely. Let's use Hisense as an example again. You can get a 65-inch U7K, or you can get a 75-inch U7K, but you cannot get a 70-inch U7K. It doesn't exist. If you wanted a 70-inch Hisense TV, you would have to step down in the range out of the U or ULED series and into the A6 or R6. So in that case, you would be taking a fairly significant picture quality hit going down to the series that has a 70-inch model versus getting the 65-inch version of a much better TV. Hope that makes sense. That's a lot of numbers. Just don't get a 70-inch TV because it's bigger than a 65, because more than likely you'll be sacrificing not a small amount of picture quality to do it. Go up to 75 inches or stick to 65. Christopher Watt writes, I have a TCL 65S450G and a Sony STR DH790 connected to the eARC port. Not high-end, but I thought that they had features I was looking for, 4K HDR and Atmos, and they do. The internet, and also the PS5 connected to the TV, is giving me some conflicting information on the eARC HDMI port on the TV though. Are all eARC ports 2.1? Are all 2.1 ports eARC? This TV has eARC, but the documentation doesn't state HDMI 2.1. What connection layout would I reap the most PS5 AV fidelity benefits from with this setup? Whew. Okay, Christopher, I'm gonna answer your more specific questions directly in a moment. First, for everyone else, let's answer a couple of the broader questions. Are all eARC ports HDMI 2.1? No, they are not. Most of them happen to be, but eARC does not need HDMI 2.1 bandwidth to do its job. eARC can pass all audio formats over the 18 gigabits per second bandwidth that's supported by HDMI 2.0B just fine. Now, are all 2.1 ports also eARC? No, they are not. I've never seen a TV with more than one eARC port. But more importantly, the question of whether your eARC port happens to be one of your HDMI 2.1 ports comes up often because many TVs only have two HDMI 2.1 ports. And when one of your HDMI 2.1 ports is also your eARC port, that can limit the number of HDMI 2.1 devices that you can connect directly to your TV. TCL is one of the only brands I can think of right now that offers two independent HDMI 2.1 ports and keeps the eARC function separate. You only need to worry whether your eARC port is also HDMI 2.1 capable for two reasons. One is, as I mentioned, if you have more than one HDMI 2.1 device that you want to connect directly to your TV, or two, if your AV receiver is HDMI 2.1 and you're connecting a PS5, Xbox Series X, or a high-end PC to that receiver, then you'd need full HDMI 2.1 bandwidth from your eARC port. If that's not you, then you don't need to worry about it. Now, for your situation, Christopher, neither your Sony receiver nor your TCL TV supports HDMI 2.1. Neither one of them has it, which isn't the end of the world. You can still get 4K 60 FPS and all the HDR formats and Atmos through your receiver. You just can't do 4K at 120 FPS. However, since your receiver doesn't support eARC, if you wanted the best audio quality, you should run your PS5 to your TV through that receiver to get the best Atmos sound. On the other hand, if keeping lag to the absolute minimum is more important, then connect the PS5 to your TV. You'll still get Atmos out to your receiver from eARC, just not uncompressed Atmos. You'll also get DTS, but not uncompressed DTS. Akash writes, we've seen how incredible MLA and QD-OLED panels are. Do you have any insight on when we could possibly see a TV that uses both of these technologies to get a TV with QD-OLED colors and MLA brightness? Well, Akash, I'm afraid the answer is that we will never see that happen, but perhaps not for the reasons some might think. At first blush, it might seem like we'd never see MLA make it to QD-OLED because LG Display owns MLA and Samsung Display owns QD-OLED, and those two rivals aren't gonna share tech. However, the real reason that we'll never see MLA paired with QD-OLED is because QD-OLED, from a technical perspective, would not benefit at all from MLA, or micro lens array technology. MLA technology was developed by LG Display to overcome inefficiencies that are inherent to LG's WRGB OLED panels. In a conventional WRGB OLED panel, there are layers that cause light to scatter, light that is essentially lost. MLA prevents that light from getting scattered by routing it straight out through the panel so that it reaches our eyes. QD-OLED panels don't suffer from light scatter because they don't have some of the layers that you'll find in a WRGB OLED panel. For example, a QD-OLED panel has no color filter. So MLA would be a useless layer in a QD-OLED TV. Now, for what it's worth, the brightness differences between MLA OLED and QD-OLED, they're pretty slim. I get the best of both worlds idea here. It's just that those two worlds can never meet. Now, editorially, I'll add that I think OLED, whether MLA or QD-OLED, has just about gotten as bright as it's ever going to get. Unless a TV manufacturer decides they're not going to worry about burn-in risk anymore and they roll back the brightness limitations that they've imposed on OLED TVs. Something tells me that's not going to happen. For a brighter OLED-like picture, I think we need to see micro LED displays implemented in normal-sized consumer TVs, or emissive quantum dot display technology needs to get deployed at a consumer level. And I think we might be close to both, actually. That's it for today's episode. Thanks as always for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I need that support as always. I'll see you on the next one, and until then, here's 2 other videos I think you might like.